Hello all, I'm CJ Werleman and this is episode number 30 of your favourite podcast, Foreign Object. For decades, black Americans have cried out against police brutality, but you weren't listening. Today, thanks to the ever-present phone camera and social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, you're finally seeing the militarised police state that black lives are subjected to. I will suspend with the pros and instead will reveal some alarming numbers. It's only the month of June, yet 464 Americans have been shot and killed by police in 2015. May was the deadliest month in more than 40 years. 33% of black people killed by police so far this year were unarmed. And now let this statistic rock your world. When police kill citizens, black people are twice as likely to be unarmed than white people. So much for thugs. Now let's compare the US with the UK. US police shoot an average of 3 people every day. Compare this to the fact that UK police were involved in only 3 shooting incidents in the past 2 years, almost 3 years. Beyond police brutality is the two-tiered justice system. For instance, blacks and whites consume drugs at equal proportions, but blacks are 3 times as likely to be incarcerated for drug offences and on average serve 10 to 15 year longer sentences. Today, the Black Lives Matter movement turns 269 days old. BLM is about more than police brutality, however. It's also a holistic civil rights movement that aims to address the socioeconomic conditions that negatively impact minorities. One activist who is at the tip of the spear of the Black Lives Matter movement is my next guest, Shaun King. Shaun is a civil rights activist, a justice commentator for the online magazine The Daily Kos, and has launched Justice Together, which aims to end police brutality. Shaun, welcome to Foreign Object.
Hey, I'm glad to talk with you, CJ, and thanks for that introduction, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. That's terrific to have you here, mate. So I don't want you to, I don't want to force you to relive a past traumatic experience, but tell me, how did you end up in hospital with more than 400 stitches to your head?
Oh, wow. Well, I have had several near-death experiences, and thankfully I haven't had any recently, but the two kind of worst experiences that I've had really kind of inform how I live my life today. And I think in a lot of ways, because I've been so close to death on more than one occasion, I try to squeeze value out every day. But most recently, I was in a very tragic car accident all the way back in 2002, and was seriously injured, and took me nearly a year to recover, and had, almost 400 stitches on my face. And I mean, it was, I have some photos. I don't know if you've seen them, but
Yeah,
they really had to sew my bottom lip back on and sew like a big part of my left eyelid back on. And so I still have some scars today, of course, after, such injuries, but it was a pretty rough ordeal. And thankfully my wife and I survived, but it was definitely traumatic. And
you called it a turning point in your life.
yeah, I think in a lot of ways, like I felt like I was a pretty good guy at life before I was in that accident. I guess I was just 22 or 23 years old at the time, but I really see my life in a lot of ways as kind of my life before the accident and my life after the accident. And I mean, I very seriously thought I was going to die, and I not just saw my life flash before my eyes in an artificial way, but I was being so near death at a point where I didn't, we had a newborn baby. We just bought our first house. It just caused me to rethink how I live life, and put me in a position where I decided to live life on purpose from then on out, and just not take my life for granted, not take opportunities for granted. And it caused me also just to want to kind of live my life in a way that mattered to the world. And ever since then, I've tried to really be the type of person that gives every day everything I have.
And so, do you believe that was a catalyst for propelling you into social movements, into social activism?
Well, not that. I don't think it was that, the car accident per se, but almost 8 years before the car accident, and I don't know if you read about this, CJ, but I was what we have in the United States what we call hate crimes, and it's kind of race-based crimes. And when I was 15 years old, I was very badly assaulted in school. I grew up in a kind of rural country town in Kentucky, and I had fractures in my face. I ended up having 3 spinal surgeries, and I missed 2 years of high school recovering from those injuries.
Wow.
And I think it was that more than anything else that caused me to think about the world in a way of how can I help people that are in pain? How can I be an advocate for people who need one, who don't have one? And because everything that happened to me with that assault was easily preventable. Like these guys who had been harassing me for over a year, I had reported it time after time after time, and the school just kind of played it to the left, and finally it just came to a boiling point. And it literally, that changed everything about my life in terms of what I cared about, how I saw myself. Like I'd never seen myself really as a victim, or as even as anyone who cared a lot about victims. I mean, obviously I was a teenager, but it put me in a position when I finally recovered from those injuries. It put me in a position where I was much more compassionate and much more aware of what people deal with on a daily basis. And so coming out of that injury and out of that assault, really, that is really what propelled me to see myself as an activist and as an organizer, and really just in the most basic way as somebody who cared about the well-being of others.
And so, and when did you sort of attach yourself then to police brutality as a specific cause, if you will?
I think a few things really got me. So even when I was in college, and I finished my undergraduate degree at Morehouse back in 2001. When I was in college, I was deeply affected by the death of Amadou Diallo, who New York police shot at him 41 times, and he was just like this hardworking guy who literally like sold socks and stuff for a living, and he was just gotten home from work and was in the vestibule of his own home, and police thought he was a criminal. He pulled his wallet out. Police thought it was a gun and shot him 41 times. And at that point, I was a teenager, and I remember thinking, wow, these people are going to go to jail for this. And this isn't like an awful crime that's happened in America. And I remember a year after the police killed Amadou Diallo, nothing happened. They had a trial, and they were all found not guilty, even though Amadou Diallo did nothing wrong. And so all the way back then, I started really being aware and caring about that. And so I've always followed it. And a few years after Amadou Diallo was killed in New York, there was another guy named Shaun, who was just a few years older than I was at the time. He was a young man, and he was at his own bachelor party the day of his wedding, and was shot almost 50 times by police who said they thought he had a gun. He didn't. And same thing, all of those officers were cleared. And I just remember thinking then, something's drastically wrong. And so I've cared for a long time, but over the past year, I've kind of given my whole life over to the issue. And back in New York again, when Eric Garner was killed in New York, he was choked to death by a police officer. It was the first time. See, I didn't see Amadou Diallo be killed, and I didn't see Shaun get killed. But when millions of us saw Eric Garner be killed on YouTube, because somebody was standing there and filmed it, I remember thinking naively, just like I thought 15 years before that, okay, somebody's going to jail for this, because he was clearly choked to death. And man, I remember former President George Bush. I saw him on the news, and George Bush said, yeah, somebody somebody's going to go to jail for this. And I mean, it was that clear to anybody who saw it, and I was so disturbed because this man was a father, and I'm a father. He had a big family, and I have 5 kids, and so I didn't see him just as a black man, but I saw him as a dad and as a grandfather, as a provider, and it just affected me really deeply. And
What affected me is his Eric Garner's daughter. Just how powerful her voice has become. And a question I wanted to ask you at some point in this interview was, she kind of framed it in a way, and it's a question I wanted to ask you, was she didn't believe that he was killed out of any racist impulse by the police, but she believed he was killed by something that's, completely inherently rotten at the core of policing in America, the us versus them mentality. It's, they're trained with this, cops in this country are trained with this battle mindset, like they're going into the streets of Fallujah to kick down doors, and the citizens are all potential criminals in waiting. Um, what do you say to the way how do you feel about the way she's framed it? If I was deaf.
First off, I try really hard to listen to what family members who've been affected by police violence, to listen to what they say and just give them deference, because that's their loved one. And so I agree with her completely that there is something seriously wrong about the way police see themselves and see others. Like what happened with Eric Garner, use of force was not even necessary. It was like, not only should he not have died, but what he was being cited for, which at that time was selling loose cigarettes, was not something that violence was necessary for. And so she's right in the sense to say, hey, this system is broken. But I think that there is something very significant. And when she made that comment, not only did she not have all of the statistical evidence that is available now, but none of us had it. And like when she made those comments, the FBI had said that in the previous year, 400 people were killed by police, but we found out now it was almost 3 times that. That the data on who's killed by police, when are they killed, where are they killed? When she made those comments, none of us even knew how bad and how serious the problem was. And so I think now the statistical data bears out that over half of African Americans, or almost half of African Americans who are killed by police, are unarmed. And whereas those numbers aren't nearly like that for white Americans who are killed by police. The majority of white Americans who are killed by police are armed. And so I think there is something there where when you see cases of black men and women killed across the country, the reason those stories really have incited a degree of frustration and anger in people is almost all the stories that we hear about of African Americans killed by police tend to be these extremely outrageous stories of men and women who weren't armed, who weren't committing violent crimes, who didn't pose an immediate threat to police in any way, and but they were lethal force was used on them. And what Eric Garner's daughter said, I understand where it came from, because if any of us look at what happened to Eric Garner and see it, we say, well, how was that racist? I didn't hear them say a racist word. I don't know how to call that racist. Well, for me, racism is more than just using a really bad word. It's how much do you value the life of someone else?
Well said. And that's what really stands out when you see Michael Brown's body left in the middle of the street for hours, like it's just, like they'd hit a dog, or, the shooting of Walter Scott in South Carolina, when that cop shot him in the back. The complete indifference to, it just reminds me of when the Israeli, Defense Force stands over the dead bodies of Palestinians. There's this complete apathy, this complete indifference to this, life which has been taken away. That's what it really hits me.
Yeah, yeah, and me too, man. And I think it's those things. Like I just wrote this article about all of the people who've been shot or critically injured by police, who police then refuse to give them any aid. Like they're still alive. Like
Mm.
I guess the one that hurt me most, and I'm a father. I have 5 kids. I only have one son, and my son is just a few years younger than Tamir Rice, this 12-year-old boy who was killed in Cleveland. But when the police shot Tamir, Tamir lived for almost 24 more hours. But when they shot him, he was literally laying on the concrete, like literally screaming and crying in pain. And the police completely ignored him. Like they didn't console him. They didn't check his vitals. They didn't provide first. They just ignored him.
That's incredible.
And and then when his older sister she saw what happened. She came to help him. They literally put handcuffs on her and put her in the police car right there next to Tamir. And it's hard for most people to ever imagine police doing that to Taylor Swift, or any other white person at all.
No.
Certainly not a celebrity, but it. And so, did the police call Tamir the N-word, or did the police have a racist tattoo? Probably not. But did they view him like the precious human being that he was to his mother? No. And I don't think anybody could ever dispute that. And he wasn't treated like someone who was valuable or loved. He was really treated like a disposable person. And to me, racism, be it unconscious or subconscious, is still the root of that.
It's incredible. When I had Chris Hedges on here in one of the earlier episodes, and I asked him, I said, if Clive and Bundy supporters were black and they pointed rifles at federal agents, and Hedges didn't hesitate, he said they would have been machine gunned down without question.
Right.
And that's when you see the juxtaposition of white versus black, just the way white lives are treated as with greater sanctity than black, certainly.
Yeah, yeah, and and I think people aren't. See, I say it like this, CJ. Like whatever we are, we're way more of that than we know. Like when you wake up in the morning, you don't look at yourself in the mirror and think about your age or your race or your ethnicity. You just wake up and you think, I'm hungry. I need to brush my teeth. I need to get ready for the day. But who we are informs us in so many different ways. And I think what a lot of the world doesn't understand is the impact that these killings have on all African Americans. And so, for instance, there was a man, John Crawford, a good guy, a young father, just in his early 20s, who was killed in a Walmart, which is a huge department store in the United States, was killed in a Walmart. And he was carrying, in a safe way actually, was carrying a BB gun that Walmart had for sale. And so he walks to the back of the Walmart and he's literally talking on the phone with his girlfriend for like 30 minutes. And he's just chilling. I've looked at all of the footage of it. He's just chilling right there. And someone sees him and thinks that he poses like this huge threat. He's never committed a violent crime in his life. Frankly, he was like a really soft guy, like a really soft, nice dude. He's just chilling in the back of Walmart talking on the telephone with his girlfriend. Police come up and literally in less than 2 seconds, they shoot and kill him. They think he's this huge threat. Well, most people, they see the news and they're like, oh, that's terrible. Well, now as a parent of black children, I'm thinking, okay, should I ever let my son in Walmart? Or like I can tell you, this is absolute truth. My kids and I went to a store called Target, which is a lot like Walmart. And I told my older kids, and they had my younger son, my kids wanted to walk around the store by themselves while my wife and I shopped. And we said yes. But I literally stopped him and said, hey, don't pick up any toy guns. Because when they killed John Crawford, it affected me. You know, it makes me feel like if they could do that to John, like there's no story of a white man being killed in Walmart carrying something that Walmart sells. There's no story, no
No.
story. Yeah, it doesn't. And so I'm thinking, wow, could my kids or could I be seen as a threat carrying something like this? And so I don't think people understand because other people just see it as a news story. But now our families all across the country are thinking, okay, is it dangerous for me to let my kids out and walk? May someone see them as a threat? And so the violence by police frightens and concerns African Americans in a deeply personal way that a lot of people really don't understand.
Yeah, and my problem is, how come white people don't get it? I mean, I'm still relatively new to the United States. I've only lived here for roughly 3 years, and I live in Southern California in a really white neighborhood. And I mean, 1980s apartheid segregated white neighborhood almost.
Right, right.
So when I speak to locals in my area about police brutality and Black Lives Matter, I get looks of total and utter indifference. I find that a lot of whites, suburban whites that I speak to, believe cop on black violence is a made-up liberal narrative. And so why are whites, particularly conservative whites, so reticent to believe this is happening in America right now?
Well, and some of the point that I was trying to make is that people, but I guess there are two ways I look at that. One is we all live in our own bubbles.
Hmm.
But we are frighteningly unaware of how real that bubble is. And so, like in my world, in Shaun land, police brutality is literally the most important issue in front of me right now. I care about it more than I care about maybe any other issue that I could name. And almost everybody I know feels very similar about it. Well, that's because in my kind of isolated, insulated culture where I'm surrounded by other people who have either been personally affected by it or secondarily affected by it, it feels like a real threat.
Hmm.
Where other people who don't live this, like for instance, I don't have any fear that anyone in my family is going to be deported because they may not have the right citizenship papers. Everybody in my family is a citizen. And so as I live and think, and maneuver throughout my day, I'm not even actively thinking about issues of citizenship, not because they don't care, not because I don't care about them or not because I'm not aware of them, but I am relatively sure that no one in my immediate circle is going to be affected by that issue. And so it's just not on my mind. Well, for most white Americans, they may feel like in their neighborhood, in their community, in their family, that there's virtually no real threat of police violence to their loved ones. And in my community, it's just very different. And so I have some grace with that because good people sometimes struggle to understand an issue that doesn't affect them. Like men struggle to understand workplace discrimination or workplace sexism because it's highly unlikely that they will ever experience it themselves.
Hmm.
And so you'll rarely see a man, even good men, you'll rarely see them speak out against sexism, in great part because they just don't think they're ever going to experience it. And so I think a lot of what has to happen is one, to show people that actually hundreds of white people do get killed by police every year. And some of them are in really egregious cases. There was a case that I'm studying now. This guy named Jordan Dillon, who was killed in Salt Lake City, a young white guy, and he was suspected of a crime, but he actually wasn't that guy, and he had headphones on and he was listening to music, and police came up behind him and told him several times to turn around, and you have to see the video. Clearly, he didn't hear them because he just kept on walking, like he was just completely oblivious to it. Finally, when he turned around, he just seemed confused, like really confused. And they shot him right there. I mean, within a second. And I just got the video today,
Wow.
and I'm staring at it, and I see that he has his headphones in. And even as he's been shot, he dies right there on the concrete. And this is one of those cases of saying like, hey, this affects everybody. It doesn't just affect African Americans, and we should all care about it. But I think the other problem is the stories of people aren't always being told effectively, CJ, where in a way that's compassionate, in a way that humanizes the victims of police violence. Like several of them, I have many really conservative friends, and when they hear the stories, they feel like it's only being told from an anti-police perspective. And in some ways, they feel like they can't hear the humanity of the victim because all they hear is what they believe to be anti-police rhetoric. And while I disagree with that on some levels, I will admit that the stories are sometimes framed and told in a way that just doesn't humanize the victims or even the police sometimes. And so, like, when video segments are done on the news, they're done in a really kind of harsh way that rarely gives people the understanding of what violence, what it's doing to families, what it's doing to parents, to children. And so it just has, for a lot of America, the issue just doesn't resonate. And so part of, we're forming this organization called Justice Together, and a huge part of what I'm trying to do is to find new ways to tell these stories that show people the devastation of police violence. Like, I mean this in the most serious way. I know I can probably tell you 10 stories off the top of my head of African Americans who had crimes committed against them, but they decided not to call 911 just because the police just scare the hell out of people. And like, that's a story that I don't think people understand. And it's a story that would be a very powerful narrative to tell, to say, I'm so afraid of what police might do if I call them that even when I'm a victim, I choose not to call them. And
that's incredible.
Yeah, and that's the reality for millions and millions of Americans. And I hear those stories, and I even have a story of my own recently where I seriously considered calling the police because of something that I saw happening. And then I thought, I don't know if I feel safe doing that. And I just chose not to call.
Wow.
And
a white person would never contemplate that alternative.
Yeah, I don't think so. But it's a real daily reality for people of color in this country. Like, The Guardian just wrote a powerful piece about how Latinos almost never call the police or even testify or give reports when they see police violence, because they're so concerned about issues of immigration and issues of discrimination that so many issues of not just police murder, but police brutality against Latinos go completely underreported. And so what you see is people of color across the country just deeply concerned about the police. And it's not to say that people still don't call, but people give it a pause before they do it, for sure.
Yeah, and coming back to your earlier point, I mean, I believe white people should care because, white people, with free market fascism that we have in this country, and with economic policies which are tilted heavily to the rich, and with the complete surrender of our political class to the corporate elite, more and more Americans are going to fall out of the middle class into poverty, and that means more and more whites are going to slip into poverty and economic despair. And again, returning to what Chris Hedges said when I had him on Foreign Object, he said the chains that are bound to impoverish minorities in urban America are the chains which are coming for the rest of us. So that's exactly why people should be attaching themselves to what you're doing, Justice Together and the like.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And a huge part of what we hope to do with Justice Together is to find, like, I have there's a guy who's on our board. His name is Jay Cranman. And I'm 35, and I think Jay's a few years older than me. Really great guy, an executive in the nonprofit industry, really respected, a white guy. And Jay and I were talking about police brutality, and Jay said something that I've shared with so many people, and it resonated with them. Jay told me, he said, Shaun, I really, really care about police brutality, but I sincerely don't know what I can do about it. And I don't know what action I can take. I don't know how I could be most useful in really making a change with it. And a huge part of what we hope Justice Together can do is to show people really practical ways, no matter what your background, your nationality, your ethnicity, for those people who do care, to give them some real action steps they can take to make a difference with it.
So how much energy does the Black Lives Matter movement have at the moment? And I asked that question in the context of, say, the Occupy movement, which started with a bang and then kind of crumbled as soon as the weather turned bad.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what. The bulk, and it's interesting that you even framed it that way, because from August, when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, until now, here we are in June, it was during a brutal winter in New York, in Minnesota, in Cleveland. Tamir Rice was killed in when there was snow on the ground, and so this movement picked up international momentum. I mean, with millions of people watching and learning about what it is during the coldest, worst months of the year. And so this movement is not like Occupy or others in that it's going to be affected by the weather. But secondly, it's getting more organized, and it's getting more organized on the local level, where men and women who care about some issue of brutality or discrimination or violence that happens in their own city all across America, people are organizing locally. And what's happened online, where men and women who care about this issue are forming kind of genuine partnerships and friendships in ways that didn't exist just a year ago. And then I think there are two more factors that I think are going to give it real momentum. Third is, this issue is being covered by the media more thoroughly than it ever has in the history of the issue. Police brutality is not new. What happened, though, if you look at in the 90s, even in the early 2000s, it appeared as if police brutality only happened in New York and Los Angeles. And so you heard about Rodney King in Los Angeles, and you heard about Amadou Diallo in New York. Well, it wasn't that police brutality wasn't happening in St. Louis or in Cleveland. It was just that New York and LA were the center of the media world in the United States. And so you would hear about brutality that happened in LA and New York because they're these two big cities with a big media presence. Well, now that police brutality is seen as a legitimate issue, it's covered not only locally, but every issue is covered nationally in a powerful way. So Walter Scott is killed in Charleston. Well, until social media really allowed people to report stories, I'd never heard about any issue of police brutality in Charleston. It's not that it didn't exist. It's that now police brutality is legitimately seen as a national news story, and social media drives that, and the national media really picks it up. Like when Walter Scott was killed in Charleston, before it ever blew up on the national news, I had people in Charleston who were sending me messages and photos, and we started sharing it, and it just took off. And by that evening, it was on the nightly news, it was on every network. But then the last thing, and this is, I think, the most tragic thing that will continue to fuel this movement in a lot of ways, is that the brutality is going to continue. And I'm not saying that this movement is fueled just by the devastation, but as long as the brutality continues, people in every city across the United States are going to have something real to protest and something real to rally around. And every factor, every study, every statistic suggests that police brutality is not getting better, it's getting worse. And we're on pace to have more people killed in the United States this year by police than last year. And so even if people want it to stop, because the brutality isn't stopping, the movement won't stop either.
Do you think it's going to change the landscape or have any impact on the landscape for the 2016 election cycle? Do you think?
I think so. I hope so. I know I can speak for myself, and I can speak for a lot of people that I know and care about. I refuse to support any candidate who doesn't take this issue seriously in a very credible way. And not only that, though, I think that you're going to find a lot of voters are willing to vote for people that are outside of the mainstream, not just locally but nationally, and even maybe be willing to cross party lines or to support someone who may not be the heir apparent, uh, if the heir apparent doesn't support the real issues. And so, like, I have heard a lot of really great things from Hillary Clinton about police brutality, issues of police brutality, but Rand Paul has also said a lot about it. And I'm not saying that I'm needing to choose between those two people, but me and a lot of other people are listening very intently
Well,
on who really credibly is addressing this issue.
one of the biggest problems that's always going to be in place, though, is our capitalist society. I mean, you can't have capitalism without racism. They're dependent. Capitalism is dependent on racism in social inequalities. Interesting. As I think it was a 2012 Pew Research poll found that 55% of African Americans have a favourable opinion of socialism and social democracy, which is something obviously Bernie Sanders champions, and it's something that I champion as well. But I don't see much of a black caucus forming for Sanders.
Like so I like Bernie Sanders a lot, but I've even been disappointed with what I've heard from him about issues of police brutality, issues of mass incarceration. Like I like him a lot. I believe in his integrity. I believe he is who he says he is. But I watched his kind of kickoff speech, and I read the manuscript, and I've tried to follow him even here over the past few weeks. And I've been surprised to not hear Bernie say a lot about police brutality at all. And that concerns me. Not about him as a person. I think he's a great leader, but it just makes me feel like it could be that in Vermont, police brutality is such a non-issue that it just doesn't register in his world. And
Do you believe it registers in Eric Holt as well? Do you believe he did enough?
well, yes and no. I definitely think, like, for instance, I watched. So I was a big supporter of Barack Obama, and I still am. But I watched how he and Eric Holder handled a lot of the issues of police brutality in Ferguson and elsewhere. I watched it very closely, and I watched it even with a degree of skepticism, to be honest with you, thinking, hey, these guys aren't going to do a lot. But I think that, first off, I think that the Ferguson report and the investigation that Eric Holder led into Ferguson was very deep and far-reaching and effective. Like, I think they exposed a lot of really deep problems and racism in Ferguson. And so people lost their jobs. But the problem is, and this is where it's not necessarily an Eric Holder thing. So the chief of police in Ferguson was out, the captain in Ferguson was out, the clerk of courts was out, but no one's convinced that the people who've replaced them are any better. And so the report was great, and the immediate consequences were pretty good. But now everyone is saying, like, hey, I feel like the new chief is as bad as the old chief. And so it reveals a limitation. Like, Eric Holder and the Attorney General's office and others, they do what they do, but politics are still really, really local. And so they came in with this kind of sweeping report, and some action steps happened. But if there aren't new hires of great people that have a different worldview, we're going to see the same system take place. And my biggest problem is not that the reports that the Attorney General's office have created, not that they're not thorough reports, it's that still almost no police officers are ever held accountable for their actions. And so, like in New York City, for instance, since 2000, 179 people have been killed by police in New York City since the year 2000, but not one officer has served a day in jail for any of those. Not one. And so the Department of Justice continues to create these really thorough reports that address the issues in a broad way, but the real people who are doing the real damage are still not held responsible for them. And that's what troubles me. And I don't know that it's a DOJ or an Eric Holder or Barack Obama problem, but it shows that even when the Attorney General says, hey, this is a terrible system, it shows that no real person is still held responsible for how terrible the system was. And the Washington Post did a study of every person killed by police since 2000 throughout the United States, and found that less than 1% of officers who kill people ever serve a day in jail. Even the study showed, even when they are even when the circumstances are egregious and people believe that someone's going to finally be held responsible, they still aren't. And it's just terrible.
What happens the day after the South Carolina cop who shot Walter Scott is acquitted, or what happens the day after the 6 Baltimore cops are acquitted in that case?
Yeah, that's a great question, CJ. And I think, and I would add Cleveland to that. Like, if the officer who shot Tamir Rice is not held responsible, here's the thing: each city is very, very different. And so in Charleston, which is a slow southern town, the response will probably be significantly different than it will be in Baltimore, where the tensions are very real and very present. And the whole culture of Baltimore is so different than the culture of Charleston and different than the culture of Cleveland, that the response in each of those cities is going to be very different. Like, I would think that if in Baltimore, when they eventually have a trial, if all 6 of those officers were set free, I would fully expect there to be full-fledged riots in Baltimore. And I'm not advocating them, but I think people would see it as such a grave injustice. See, here's what happens, is people say, okay, let's use the system. And then when they use the system and no one is found guilty, people are left with no recourse. And I'm not saying the only option is a riot, but when you tell people, trust the system, trust the system. And then they trust it, albeit reluctantly, and then get rejected by it. People get desperate, uh, and desperate people act in ways that are difficult for the world to understand, and they would act even in ways that they wouldn't if they didn't feel that way. And so what happens is other people who see Baltimore may see it and say, I just don't understand how people could riot.
Mm.
Well, probably because you don't understand the desperation. Like, I tell it like this, and this we get back to storytelling, is if you knew with 100% certainty that somebody killed your most cherished loved one, and they walked into court and said they didn't do it, but you knew they did it, and all evidence said they did it, but some reason or another, they were all found, the person who killed your most precious loved one was found not guilty, how would you feel? Would you feel like killing that person? Would you feel like screaming at the top of your lungs? Would you feel like turning chairs over in the courtroom? Most people say, yeah, hell yeah. I'd be irate. I'd lose my mind if someone killed my wife or my son or my brother and I knew they did it and they just got to walk free. I don't know what I would do. Well, there's a sense, particularly in the black community, there's this sense of shared responsibility of when someone like Freddie Gray is killed, it feels like a brother. It feels like it's someone you know. I've never met Freddie Gray, but it matters to people in a way that goes beyond blood relatives. And in Baltimore, I think that's what you're seeing is you're seeing people who've been oppressed by that system in Baltimore. The economy in Baltimore is terrible. And if somebody is not held responsible for him having a severed spine, people are going to lose it. And what I'm hurt about is I don't know what else to tell. I won't know what else to tell people at that point. And people, everyone says, "Hey, riots are counterproductive," and in a way, I believe that, but I don't know what to tell people who trusted the system and then it fails them. And that's the question that we're dealing with. Like, I've come to know some of Tamir Rice's family, and I don't know what people are going to tell their family if the officer who shot their 12-year-old son is not held responsible in some way. And
are you optimistic?
No, I'm not optimistic in any case. Not in Baltimore. And here's the crazy thing, CJ. I am an incredibly optimistic person. Like, it's who I am in my soul. It's what I teach as a principal. It's what I teach my kids. It's how I live. But there are no facts that lend any of us to believe we should ever be optimistic about police being held responsible. Because we started out this conversation where I mentioned to you Amadou Diallo and Shaun Bell. Amadou was shot 41 times and Shaun Bell 50 times. Completely unarmed, incredibly good guys. And those officers were charged and then found not guilty. And so there's very little optimism. And it hurts me to say that because I'm an extremely optimistic guy, but there's very little cause for optimism. And that's troubling.
The system is completely broken, and there's no doubt about it. And my concern is that as as I alluded to before, with the middle class shrinking in this country, whites will instinctively urge for more law and order, which will mean more, heading down that path of militarizing the police even more with heavy surveillance, harassment, and the like. So, I share your pessimism, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, and what troubles me is like that pessimism, like even less than I would call it pessimism, is just like realistic. Like there's a part of me that, like I've been optimistic in case after case. After a while, you just feel like, hey, I'm setting myself up for failure here, thinking that something good is going to happen and it doesn't. And so, there's a real part of me that wants to believe and is still hopeful. And so, like in Baltimore, there are some hints that we have a reason to be optimistic. The state's attorney there, Marilyn Mosby, has done a great job, has been very aggressive about the case. But if these officers are convicted, it would be groundbreaking because almost no officer is convicted. Like, I kind of played a game one time and I asked people, I said, without searching Google, name for me one officer who's been convicted of killing someone. Just name them for me. And people can't do it.
No.
And so out of thousands and thousands of people who've been killed, there have been almost no convictions. And so you are almost foolhardy to be optimistic. And I think that's what's creating a lot of the frustration, man. Is it's a desperate position to be in when millions of people are a bit hopeless.
Mate, that's we've reached the shot clock. Tell how can my listeners support Justice Together?
Well, CJ, we are launching Justice Together on June 16th. Mm-hmm. So depending on when people hear the podcast, they can go to justicetogether.org, and they can also follow Justice Together on Twitter, and there'll be updates there. We have some really amazing things that we're launching and practical ways for people to get involved, and there'll be more information there. People can always follow me on Twitter as well, at Shaun King, ShaunKing, and we're welcoming people from all backgrounds, all political parties, ways of life, because we really think that's what it's going to take to address this issue in a serious way.
I urge all of you to follow Shaun on Twitter. If you really want to get a snapshot of what's happening in America at a level that you might not see, particularly if you're white, you get a real sense of the black reality in this country. So follow him at Shaun King. Shaun, mate, it's been terrific chatting with you, and mate, it's been enlightening, and I certainly want to thank you for your time. It's been great.
Yeah, I appreciate it, CJ. Take care, and I look forward to staying connected with you, man.
Yeah, for sure, buddy. All right, mate. Yeah. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, take care. Bye.
See you, mate. Bye-bye.